30 seconds. All right, Deb, you gonna flip it over? Let people in?
Yes, so I will let everyone who's in the waiting room in now. We're at 30 and counting, so I'll go on mute. Good luck, everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Doris Nguyen, and I'm with DTSC. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We're here to discuss the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, and this is the second of a series of 4 webinars that we are hosting. We're just going to give everyone a moment to join the webinar, and while we're waiting, we're going to take a short poll. Devin's going to take a minute to bring up the poll. So the poll reads, what is your organization's relationship to the site that you're thinking of applying for? Just please choose one. The options are owner, prospective purchaser, tenant, or a long-term lease, or other. We're just going to give everyone just a minute or two to respond to that while we are waiting for everyone to join. So thank you very much. So if you've just joined us, welcome. And we just took a poll. And so we were asking about your organization's relationship to the site. And it looks like a majority of them are other, followed by owner and then a prospective purchaser. So thank you very much for taking the poll. We appreciate it. I think we've got a good group here today. So I would like to welcome you again if you're just joined. And we're talking about the second webinar of a series of 4. And today's webinar is going to focus on eligibility. So we are going to talk about ownership and access, regulatory oversight, and ECRG tasks. Next slide, please, Devin. I'd like to talk about the meeting guidelines. By participating, you understand that the meeting is being recorded and we may mute you for background noise. We will be using the chat feature to distribute information and accept feedback. That'll be read during the Q&A period. So the Q&A period will be at the end of the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Miriam Tasnif-Abbasi. Miriam actually holds 2 roles here at DTSC. She is both the Brownfields Development Manager as well as she manages the ECRG program. Miriam?
Thank you so much, Doris, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for this second ECRGenius webinar. I am going to actually hand the floor over to Greg Schaefer. Greg Schaefer is our statewide Brownfield coordinator, and he's going to be spending some time with us this morning talking about various deeper aspects of the eligibility criteria. So with that, go ahead and turn it over to Greg.
It would help if I unmuted myself. Thank you. Thank you, Miriam. These are the topics that we're going to cover today. I just want to lay a little bit of groundwork. The slides are relatively text dense. There's a lot of nuance to some of these eligibility criteria. So I just wanted to let you know, we may not speak to every single detail on these slides, but they are there for your reference when you go back and review or either rewatch this recording. The slides will be made available about 1 week alongside the recording. So, we are going to be presenting all this information to you and then supplying it for your use later, sometime next week, more than likely. So we're going to very briefly go over what was covered during last week's ECRGenius, how to decide what grant to apply for, the ownership and access requirements for your site, the CERCLA liability defense requirements, how you can obtain regulatory oversight if you don't already have it, and how you can design your ECRG tasks and budget to ensure that they are all eligible expenses. Next slide, please. So very, very quickly, last week was covered site eligibility. So it must be a brownfield, you must own or have access to the site. And we also talked about the nuance associated with the Cal Enviro screen or CES score being 75% or higher, or using the poverty percentile of 50% or higher, and the associated reuses that are eligible under those different criteria. The eligible applicants are public entities, nonprofits, 501c3 nonprofits, tribes regardless of federal recognition, and if you are a round 1 ECR grantee, you must have expensed at least 70% of your grant allocation. Next slide, please. Based on some of the questions from last week, we wanted to add in this slide, just really going over what is the site. So we wanted to make it very clear that as the applicant, you can define your site however you need to. And what we recommend is that you define your site in such a way that it meets all of the eligibility criteria. So obviously we're going to go over all the criteria that need to be met, but you have the flexibility to omit portions of your development that may not meet those eligibility criteria. So for example, if you have a broad, let's say you have a 10-acre development that you're going to do, and it's a park, affordable housing, a community center, and market rate housing as well. That market rate housing or some of the other components may not meet the eligibility requirements. So you can omit those portions of the site and define your ECRG application site as just the components that are eligible. So last year, this came about because people applied on behalf of the entire development, and we had to kind of tailor their application to make it fit. And in round 2, we are asking it for you to do that work for us. Really be specific on the on understanding what components are eligible and what components are ineligible, because we're not going to have as much capacity, I think, to kind of walk people through those nuances. Some important other notes associated with this: there can be no more than 2 owners in our application. Just because of the structure of the application system, it can't accommodate that information. So the site needs to have no more than 2 owners. If there are more than 2, you may need to submit multiple applications for the project. And there can be no more than 1 CERCLA liability defense scenario. And Tris is going to be talking in a few slides about the nuances of that CERCLA liability defense. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, which we'll get to a little bit later as well, is that the site name, how you define the site on your application, should really match what is on your regulatory oversight agreement, just so there's no confusion. And DTSC has a very clear line of the site that you're applying for, the site that's under oversight, and the site that's being redeveloped. Next slide, please. Should you apply for an investigation grant or a cleanup grant? So in round 2, we've very clearly defined that a site-specific cleanup grant must have a cleanup plan either submitted or approved by the regulatory oversight agency. If you are, doing site-specific environmental work and you have not submitted an environmental cleanup document to your regulator, then you will only fit under the site-specific investigation scenario. So pre-cleanup plan, you should apply for a site-specific investigation. Post-cleanup plan, you can apply for a site-specific cleanup. If you are unsure, we really recommend you talk to your regulatory oversight agency. They will be the one that tells you whether or not you are ready for cleanup or not. Last but not least, your regulatory oversight agency will be able to confirm this through the project suitability letter, which is another eligibility component that we'll be talking to a little bit later on. Next slide, please. What are the access and ownership requirements? So in the guidelines section 2.2, access is very clearly defined that the applicant must own the site or have documented access for the site during the 2-year funding period. So this applies to all the parcels that comprise your site. We just need to make sure here at ECRG that the work that you're proposing in your application, you're going to be able to implement that without any barriers for access. So some examples of this is that you as the applicant are providing your grant deed, naming the applicant as the owner for each parcel, or you may provide a purchase and sale agreement, and the terms of that purchase and sale agreement show that you are granted access for the entire grant term, which would be 24 months. Or another scenario is that the applicant provides a written access agreement specifying that you have access to the parcel for, again, the entire grant term. Again, last note on here, just reiterating that if there are more than 2 owners for the various parcels associated with a larger site, separate ECRG applications will need to be submitted. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Tris Chesney, to talk about CERCLA liability defense.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So what is a CERCLA liability defense? This information is taken directly out of our guidelines, section 2.5. And this approach is consistent with other state and federal brownfields grants where we're looking at the CERCLA liability defense. So to be eligible for a site-specific investigation or a site-specific cleanup, applicants must demonstrate that they are not in any way liable for any releases or threatened releases of hazardous substances at the site under CERCLA. And the CERCLA is our federal Superfund law. And the party, they must also demonstrate that this is essentially a demonstration that a party is not responsible for the contamination as defined under CERCLA. And for site-specific cleanup, applicants must demonstrate that either they or the owners have a CERCLA liability defense. Next slide. So when is a CERCLA liability defense required? We put together this table. This is a table taken right out of our ECRG Self-Check Tool. It's also in our guidelines. And it's really about finding which box you fit in to help you figure out if you need to provide a CERCLA liability defense. And so
United States, California, and Pacific.
Excuse me. Oh, I think I heard somebody. So tribes are exempt from the requirement to demonstrate a CERCLA liability defense for sites that they own. And then if you look up in the boxes up here, depending on the type of application that you're applying for and whether you own the site or not, that's how you help find which box you're in. And then we can go to the next slide and go through a little bit more detail. So CERCLA liability defense is not required for community-wide assessments. They are required for site-specific investigations, depending on whether the applicant owns a site. So applicants who own the site need to provide a CERCLA liability defense. Applicants who do not own the site must provide an owner attestation form. So that attestation form is attestations by the owners demonstrating that they do not, they're not liable for the contamination. And then for site-specific cleanups, all site-specific cleanups require CERCLA liability defense for the owner, whether it is the applicant or not. Municipalities, local governments may have exemptions depending on when the property was acquired and how the property was acquired. For example, involuntary acquisitions, DTSC recommends that you can consult your legal counsel, and tribes that own sites never need a CERCLA liability defense. Next slide. And do all parcels require a CERCLA liability defense? So if a CERCLA liability defense is required in accordance with the boxes in that table, it must be provided for each parcel. And as Greg mentioned previously, excuse me, our system can only handle one CERCLA liability defense for each application. So if there are multiple CERCLA liability defenses, you may need to submit multiple applications. And then detailed explanations regarding CERCLA liability defense are provided in the ECRG Self-Check Tool.
All right. Who could now, thank you, Trish, for all that information and providing the eligibility self-check tool. I think a link was also put into the chat, linking you to it as well. We really can't recommend it enough. It walks you through all of the eligibility criteria and gives you the different scenarios where those eligibility criteria would apply, depending on your site's specific scenarios. Moving on, we're going to move onto regulatory oversight. Which is another of these eligibility criteria. It is required for site-specific investigations and site-specific cleanups, and it is optional for community-wide assessments. So it is not required for community-wide assessments, but if you do choose to have an oversight agency look over some of the documents you're preparing, it is an eligible expense for all grant types. The regulatory oversight can be provided by DTSC, a regional water quality control board, a local oversight agency, and we included a link here to the, there are some regulations on which agencies are able to provide oversight within California, and the link included in this presentation has a list of those agencies that have self-certified. And then tribes may also provide their own environmental regulatory oversight. We do want to just note, if a tribe is planning on performing their own regulatory oversight, we are just asking that you meet with us at DTSC because we really want to understand the structure of your agency and the expertise available to the staff within your own tribe, just to ensure that all of the appropriate steps are taken that basically DTSC would expect on our own cases. If DTSC is not the oversight agency, we are requiring that a project suitability letter be prepared. This project suitability letter we're going to see on the next slide, it is really just it's a way to notify the regulatory oversight agencies that the applicant is preparing a grant application with DTSC for funding, to confirm kind of the status of their project, whether the site's ready for a cleanup or whether it should apply for an investigation, and really to help you build a stronger budget to ensure that all of the tasks that your regulator expects you to perform are appropriately budgeted for. We did want to note some of the deadlines that are included here. So if you need a new oversight agreement, you're not currently under oversight, and you need to enter into a voluntary agreement with DTSC, we are saying that the deadline for that is September 11th to submit your request for agency oversight. This deadline is DTSC's guarantee that if you submit an application by September 11th, we will get you into a voluntary oversight agreement before the end of the grant application period. Same thing with the regional board. Their application deadline would be September 11th as well. We recommend that you speak to them as early as possible and let them know that you are planning on submitting a request for oversight, just to ensure there aren't any hiccups. And that the deadline is also for requesting your project suitability letter as well. So letting them know that even if you are you're in an existing oversight agreement, that you need this project suitability letter prepared that will need to be signed by their management. Last are the local agencies. There are about 13 of them, so we recommend that you contact them directly and contact them no later than September 5th. Give yourself a little bit more time, just because of the nuances at the local level can be a little bit different. So again, early, our recommendation is always early and often, for engagement with your regulator. Next slide, please. This was just some general criteria about the voluntary oversight structure. The agreement must be voluntary. It cannot be an order. So at DTSC, more than likely what you would see is called a standard voluntary agreement. At the local level, there is some variability, but in statute, they're typically called a voluntary remedial action agreement. They might also be called a voluntary cleanup agreement or some other iteration of this term. And then at the regional board, most often what we see is just a cost recovery letter. It's a very simple letter. But there is one exception, and one important exception that we've made for the regional board as well, which is a section 13267 order. But again, this needs to be approved by the regional board. So it is dependent on the regional board themselves to make this exception in their project suitability letter for you to provide with your application. The one important difference between round 1 and round 2 is that the regulatory oversight agreement must be in the applicant's name. So it's not just enough for the site to have an oversight agreement with some other party. The applicant applying for ECRG funds must be named on the oversight agreement themselves. Again, this kind of goes back to the reimbursement-based grant that ECRG is. So when you submit your expenses for oversight, it's in the grantee's name, and then DTSC is able to reimburse those costs. And last but not least, a copy of your voluntary agreement and your project suitability letter, if it's required, must be provided in your application itself. Next slide, please. This is just the template project suitability letter. It is available on our ECRG webpage. It gives all of the information that we're looking for. We put this template together in consultation with the regional boards to ensure that their project management staff would be able to easily plug in the information and get this letter to the applicants in a timely manner. So this is really shouldn't come as a surprise. It's available on the website. I would say take a minute to quickly look over it. I think the important thing, like I mentioned earlier on, is to talk to your regulator early about this. You can see that the signatory for this letter is either the assistant executive officer at the regional board or the local oversight agency's management. So just to get this letter pushed through their management structures, we really recommend you request this letter early on. Next slide, please. All right, moving on to costs associated with ECRG. Like was mentioned during the last week's webinar, and I mentioned just a couple slides ago, ECRG is a reimbursement-based grant, but we are asking you to really put together a strong budget in this application. So I'm going to go over the eligible task categories on the next slide, but these are some of the important considerations that you need to think about when you're building an adequate budget for your project. So because ECRG is a state-funded program, prevailing wage applies where to any of the labor categories that require prevailing wage, and you really need to take that into account when you're putting together your budget. Prevailing wage can increase costs significantly depending on what kind of work is being done. So just make sure that's taken into account wherever it is applicable. The applicant must also have contracting practices in place to ensure fair market costs through a competitive procurement process for any contracts over $10,000. This is coming straight from our guidelines. And then the applicant must also have a contracting policy that requires diverse suppliers be considered, such as disabled veteran business enterprises, disadvantaged business enterprises, or small business enterprises. Again, with the E and ECRG being equitable, we are trying to build in as much equity as we can into all of the various components of this grant. We do have a quick reference guide available on our website about how small businesses can become certified and participate in some of the contract opportunities available from this funding. Next slide, please. This is a condensed version of the eligible tasks or tasks that are eligible for reimbursement under ECRG. In the guidelines themselves, there will be a little bit more specificity under each of these categories, but I wanted to just generally go over what these are for each of the different grant types. And you can see that site-specific cleanups have the most categories of eligible expenses, and community-wide assessments have the least. And again, this is just moving a project through the various levels of complexity. So because the site-specific cleanup has the cleanup plan cutoff point, right? None of those cleanup costs are eligible for reimbursement under an investigation grant, right? And then community-wide assessments have a little bit of a different focus. And so you can do things like the brownfield planning and inventory. You can do some really early stage investigation work and things like that. And so as you move through the various stages of a project, more and more costs become eligible. These are color coded based on the key on the bottom left here. So regulatory oversight fees are eligible across the board. Grantee project management and labor and travel, up to 5% of your grant allocation can be used for that. Community engagement contracts are in green, and then environmental contracts are the orange color. And this correlates to the next slide, slide 17, please, where it is the budget breakdown. So this is what the budget table looks like in Flux. It's been color coded here for the presentation, just to correlate with this previous slide, but it's not color coded in the application itself. We just don't have that functionality. But this is the way that we are going to expect you to put together your budget. Each column is the task that you're going to be requesting funding for. And then we're asking you to break it down by those various categories. So regulatory oversight, an environmental contract, community engagement contract, and then any grantee direct costs. So we expect that the majority of your costs are going to fall under that orange color, the environmental contracts color. But we just want to be able to track the various dollar amounts and do some of our own internal reporting. An important note here is you can add as many columns as you needed for the various tasks that you're going to be requesting funding for. Again, we do ask that you budget for the 24-month period of the grant term. So, you may have, depending on where you are with your project, you may have tasks that come in after your grant term or some tasks that have been completed before your grant term, but we are only looking at the funding period of this grant proposal. Next slide, please. Some of the ineligible, I just wanted to really briefly mention ineligible costs. All of the eligible categories were shown on slide 16. They basically cover tasks related to the environmental assessment, investigation, and cleanup. ECRG doesn't pay for any of the development costs or site preparation for development or any of those things. It is really only for the environmental work associated with it. In the guidelines, we have a section 2.8 that lists a lot of the ineligible tasks. Some of the, I would say the biggest questions that we get are tests that were completed before the grant are not eligible, as well as preparation of the application is not an eligible expense either. It's important to note that if ineligible tasks are included in your application, the grant application can be denied. So if you're unsure, if you don't think that something fits in one of those categories, either ask DTSC, or really we recommend you schedule an application assistance call with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, our Brownfield technical assistance provider. Next slide, please. I'm just going to very briefly mention that reuse is a requirement of the grant. Next week, our webinar number 3 is going to do an in-depth dive on the requirements for reuse based on some of the different site-specific criteria. We don't have time to talk about it today because there is a lot of nuance to it. And so I just wanted to really plug the next week's webinar. That's going to be the same thing for the next couple slides. So next slide, please. And we're going to talk about some of the other eligibility requirements that are going to be talked about next week. So the next one is community engagement. Again, it is a requirement for ECRG, and there's a lot of nuance to it. So we really recommend you sign up for next week's webinar. And last but not least, Next slide, please. Are the community benefit commitments, another eligibility requirement. You can see some of the information here. 1 is required for community-wide assessments, 2 is required for investigations, and 2 or 3 are required for cleanups. Again, that nuance is going to be described in detail next week, and we really, really recommend you sign up for next week's webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the a slide for the ECRG schedule. We have a new round 2 guide. It is a 1-page flyer that goes over a lot of the important dates for ECRG, a lot of the important information and contacts and ways to get application assistance. We really recommend you use this for either sharing it with your clients, sharing it with your management if you need to get approval to apply for funding or anything like that. It's a really great breakdown of what ECRG is and when it's happening this year. Just briefly on the schedule, you can see, we're at webinar number 2. It's Tuesday, August 1st. Our application is going to open Monday, August 14th. It's just less than 2 weeks away. And then the application is going to close on Monday, October 9th. We are anticipating that grants will be awarded and grant agreements executed in the February 2024 timeframe. Next slide, please. All right, how can you prepare for your ECRG application? We have all of our resources that have been described are on our website, our ECRG web pages specifically. We can't recommend the Eligibility Self-Check Tool enough. There are all of the eligibility requirements described, laid out in a really easy to use checklist. It's also going to help you collect the information needed that's going to need to be directly fed into your application, as well as the documents that need to be provided to support your application as well. Participate in ECRGenius webinars. I guess you all are one step ahead. You're already participating in one today. And then work with our Brownfield technical assistance provider, the Center for Creative Land Recycling. They can do one-on-one application assistance. If you get in early enough, they can also do application reviews before you submit them to DTSC. And then last but not least, pro bono environmental consultants. Miriam, did you want to talk about that at all? I think there's some, yeah.
Sure, just very briefly, our Brownfield technical assistance provider, CERCLA, they have solicited some volunteers who will be available to assist with applications. And that's about it. I think that especially comes into play when we have applicants who are looking to design budgets who don't understand how the cleanup process, the investigation process, or the assessment process works. At that time, I think it really is critical to consult with a professional. And so work with CERCLA, and I believe they're able to share that information with you.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Greg.
Slide 24, please. All right, I've mentioned it a couple times now, but to get free Brownfield technical assistance, please work with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. There's a link included to set up an appointment with them. Again, they can help you with early stage ECRG project envisioning, site eligibility, verification and questions, how to really tailor your application to be as strong as possible. And then working through, again, that application pre-submittal review. So we do have a great statistic down here. 95% of the applicants who worked with CERCLA last year in round 1 were actually awarded funding. So it is a very helpful tool, free tool that's available to you all. Next slide, please. All right, so I've already plugged it on a few slides, but ECRGenius number 3 is going to be about engagement, equity, and reuse. It's next week, Tuesday, August 8th. Again, a synopsis of the ECRG engagement approach, community benefit commitments, equitable reuse, and contract requirements. It's also co-presented with the University of California at Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute. It is, like I mentioned, the community benefit commitments, equitable reuse, and contract requirements are eligibility components as well to ECRG. So it's going to be a really great webinar to help you complete those portions of the application. And then ECRGenius number 4 Of course, we think all of our webinars are very important, but this one is going to be very helpful as well. Flux, our application portal, is going to be Flux in our application walkthrough webinar on Tuesday, August 15th. It is going to walk you through all of the different application sections and really help you, navigate the system and look at the specific components of these sections included in the application. So it's going to be really helpful for just completing the application overall and understanding the actual content. Miriam, did you want to speak to webinar 4 at all?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to reiterate the emphasis that you placed on all the webinars, but 4 in particular is going to be really useful for applicants who know that they are going to be applying. I know that we have applicants who may be early, who are considering it, who maybe are planning for round 3, which is great. But if you are planning on applying, then I think that section by section walkthrough is going to be really helpful as we are going through the actual application, talking through maybe sometimes what we meant when we asked certain questions. And so I think that will be particularly useful for people to participate and have the opportunity to ask questions.
Thanks, Mary.
You're welcome.
All right, next slide, please. I think that's the end of the presentation, and we're going to move into Q&A. Great.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Greg. So we'll move over to the Q&A section. Devin, if you could hit the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are a couple of ways that you can provide questions during this webinar. Feel free to use the raise hand feature, and you'll be called on to unmute your audio when it is your turn. Thank you, Taylor, for following directions so well. You can also, if you're calling in, you can press *9 to join the phone queue. And then I will say the last 4 digits of your phone number when it's your turn, and then you would just select *6 to unmute your line. And then you can also just type your question in the chat. We had a couple already. So feel free to use the chat feature to have your question read by me. So Taylor, you will be next. We have one question just right ahead of you. So Yamini asked, can a CWA or investigation grant be used to prepare a post-closure land use plan if the redevelopment area overlaps with a portion of a closed landfill? I can also, okay.
Sorry, Lydia, do you want me to go ahead? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say, I can also put the question in the chat one more time.
Okay, no, I got the question. I think this is something we'd like to have a discussion on because I'm not as familiar with the post-closure land use plan, and it may not necessarily fit into one of our investigation or cleanup buckets if it's not associated with any kind of active investigation or active cleanup. So I would say let's go ahead and have a discussion on this. Make sure the site isn't under some kind of enforcement order, which many landfills are. And so there may be other reasons why this site might not be a good fit, but we definitely want to tackle that in a conversation.
Thank you, Miriam. Taylor, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Just kind of preliminary question. So does the initial site need to be in a HUD designated qualified census tract location, or is it okay if, for example, we have some surplus land and we're going to have an affordable developer come in to provide affordable housing? Would that be eligible for, or just preliminarily, is that one that we could look at? Because really we have some potential impacts, and that's why we're looking at it.
Yeah, we did talk about this a little bit last week.
Okay.
For sites that have affordable housing, they do need to meet the LIHOC definition of affordability in order to qualify outside of the Cal Enviroscreen census tract 75% and higher scores, or the 50% poverty percentile. We do have a web tool available on our webpage as well that really that shows you the geography of the ECRG coverage areas, which will help you kind of make that designation. So we'd recommend you first take a look and figure out what that Cal Enviroscreen score is to see which of the site eligibility criteria might apply to it.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And that ECRG screener is on your site, right?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Taylor. So Vicky asked, this is not a first come, first served grant, correct? All applications will be reviewed at the same time?
That is correct. So you need to submit your application during the application period. They're all going to be reviewed for eligibility and then scored. If there's not enough funding available for all of the eligible applications, then it will be a competitive grant.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg. We also got a question from Danny saying that the local government owned a parcel that was obtained by the quit claim deed from railroad over 20 years ago. CEQA was completed at the time, but they do not have the report. Can they still proceed? Can CERCLA Defense still proceed?
This is one.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Greg. Go ahead.
I was gonna say this is one where we would really recommend you schedule a Brownfield technical assistance call with the Center for Creative Land Recycling to work through that CERCLA liability defense. If you are doing, we have some of the very basic acquisition information is available in our self-check tool to talk about some of the exemptions that that may be available to local governments under CERCLA. 20 years ago is a big question mark because there was a big change approximately 20 years ago. So it's really going to depend on the specifics of the date of acquisition and the way that the site was applied. So again, we would really recommend you sign up for the free technical assistance to go over the specifics of the scenario.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Greg. Jack asked if you can provide further clarification on the 2-year grant term. What if a task is started within the term but is not completed?
So like I said, the grant funding term is 24 months from the date that DTSC signs and executes the grant agreement. So during that 24-month period, any of the eligible tasks will be eligible for reimbursement. So if you started a task prior to your grant agreement being executed, any of those costs associated prior to the grant term would not be eligible. As soon as the date the grant agreement is executed, if that same task is an eligible category, it would start being reimbursable from the date that the grant agreement was executed until the end of the grant term.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg.
I'm going to jump in on that and add a little bit more to what Greg stated. I'd like to go back to like designing the budget and schedule. So if you know ahead of time that this is a 30-month task, when you design your budget is designed for what can be completed within the 2-year funding term of the grant. So and we understand, I mean, cleanups have taken a lot longer, but because we have a 2-year grant, only design your budget for what you can accomplish in that 2-year time frame. Because if you are just giving the estimate that is for your entire cleanup design, which is a 5-year process, then that's not going to work for us. It's a very strong emphasis on come to us with 2 years worth of work.
Perfect. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, Jack. So Victoria is asking for clarification on whether the site-specific cleanup plan only has to be submitted and reviewed by the application date, or if it has to be submitted, reviewed, and approved by a regulatory agency by the application date.
So it doesn't necessarily need to be approved. We think that an approved cleanup plan is going to be a stronger application. But again, it's going to be up to your regulatory oversight agency to talk about that in their project suitability letter. So if you submit it to them, and you ask for the project suitability letter, it is possible that they come back and say, we don't think your site's ready for cleanup yet. We would recommend that you do additional investigation prior to that. So it doesn't have to be approved necessarily, but it does need to be submitted to them, and they need to provide that project suitability letter, basically affirming that they agree that the site's ready for cleanup.
Thank you, Greg. So John has provided some information, some background on a site and what they hope to do with it. They say that a local community owns a site and they would like to increase its adjoining park and create a larger regional park. The existing ground monitoring wells are in place and quarterly monitoring is continuing. It has been also replaced with clean soil. What process would DTSC consider in order to use the 15-acre site for park uses?
I mean, I don't think we would have enough information to really answer, what that, we would recommend that you talk to your regulator, apply for oversight, and they're going to help you put together that scope of work, which would end up, feeding into your budget, your schedule and budget that you would put in as part of your ECRG application. So really it needs to be a conversation with whichever regulatory oversight agency you're going to be applying for, and you're going to need to provide all of the background information available there.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, John. Are there any more questions? I don't see anyone's hand raised. Feel free to put any more questions in the chat or unmute yourselves by raising your hand. Oh, Taylor has a follow-up question. So if a site is less than 75% CS 4.0 percentile, but reuse is for 100% affordable project and disadvantaged community, but the CS poverty percentage is not 50%, could this work?
Again, we're really going to strongly recommend that brownfield technical assistance. There are some specific affordability requirements associated with the affordable housing developments that are below the 75% threshold, the 75% CES or 50% poverty percentile threshold. So that it's going to depend on the actual affordability of that affordable housing redevelopment. So we would recommend that you get those site specifics put together and schedule an application assistance call. But it sounds like something that might be able to work.
Thank you, Greg. And then Estrida, I saw your hand was up first. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good morning. I'm from Lodi. I tuned in late and like to ask a two-part question. One is, does the site have to be owned by the city? If it is not owned by the city, will the DTSC entertain a partnership agreement with the party that does own the site?
So ECRG does not require site ownership. There are some specific scenarios in terms of the CERCLA liability defense and access requirements that we did talk about a little bit earlier on. And this webinar will be available, the recording will be available in about a week for you to go back and look at it too. But in terms of a partnership agreement, DTSC is not allowing partnerships to apply for funding. We're not considering them to be eligible entities. So the city would need to apply on their own and meet all of the eligibility requirements. So that, I think that would affect things like the regulatory oversight agreement would also need to be in the city's name for those costs to meet the eligibility requirements for the site as well.
Just to reiterate then, the proposed site or area does not have to be owned by the city for eligibility for this grant.
That is correct.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. So Terry also put in the chat, how can an environmental consulting company be added to the pro bono list? I have the link ready if we are still accepting companies, Greg and Miriam.
Yeah, that's something that CClear is taking the lead on, Lujane. So feel free to work with them specifically.
Thank you. And then Taylor, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thanks for answering that question. Sorry, just quick follow-up. So it's really about the reuse of the site, because the current site is not necessarily, the land as is would not necessarily be in those zones. It's like 69%, like I said, and the other one is not. It's like 25%. But since it's subject to Surplus Land Act, we're going through the HCD process. We're getting affordable housing developers to look at the site. The end goal is to get an affordable housing development on the site. Because the reuse is going to be affordable, would it potentially still be something to look at? Because if it's just the existing underlying site, then I just don't want to, I want to make sure that that's cleared up.
So Greg, let me jump in for this. Taylor, I think we need to have a conversation because with the Surplus Land Act, I want to understand who actually owns the site. Sometimes we have like state-owned properties, so that's going to require a conversation.
Yeah, it's city owned. We own it.
Got
Yeah. And
okay.
It's right next to a water tank system. Yeah. So.
Got it. And so if I understand the situation correctly, there may potentially be some contamination on the site.
Mhm.
And you are considering the site for affordable housing.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So I just, based on the question that you asked earlier, I popped in what the definition that we're borrowing for low income housing. So that's just something that you will need to know. And I think we should have a conversation because it looks like your site could be one that works. So I would advise you to take a look at the eligibility self-check tool that we have online.
Yes.
And also, you know, just get a sense of like what kind of affordable housing you think you're planning, because if it meets our definition, then we should have a conversation to see what we can do to answer your questions and have you come in. Doris from my office, who did our introduction, will reach out to you and set up some follow-up calls.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I went ahead and scheduled a meeting with the technical support too. So thanks so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Student, do you have another question? I see that your hand is still raised.
No, thanks.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Again, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourselves or put your questions in the chat. Also, if you're calling in, just press *9 to join the phone queue and then *6 to unmute your line.
While we're waiting for people to think about perhaps more questions that they have, I just wanted to remind everyone that the self-check tool that we have at a website needs to be updated. The component about affordable housing following the low-income housing tax credit requirement, that hasn't been updated, and we're making some other tweaks as well for clarity. So even though that tool is generally close to where we are, the newer version is going to be coming out soon, and it's going to be updated and a little bit more streamlined. So I did want to share that with everybody and specifically point out that the eligibility component to allow affordable housing development anywhere in the state, as long as it meets this specific requirement, the CES score is not an issue. So I wanted to share that. Jane, if we don't have any more questions, I'd say we can go ahead and send everybody back to their workdays a little ahead of schedule.
That sounds great to me. Yeah, if anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Oh, Ronald, are you raising your hand?
Thanks for recognizing me. No, I'm just saying goodbye.
Oh, okay.
Informative. I'll see you in the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Great. Thank you so much.
Good job, Greg and Doris and Tris.
Great job.
And Lujane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, everyone.
Everyone for participating.
Good job, everyone. Yeah, thank you.